The moment August Walden rode into Dusty Creek, Texas, in the spring of 1878, every man with a lick of sense in his head pulled him aside and told him the same thing: stay away from Theresa Wainwright. They said it kindly at first. Old Hector Barnes, who ran the feed store on the corner of Main and Sycamore, pressed a weathered hand to August's shoulder the very afternoon he arrived, before the dust from the trail had even settled off his coat. Hector had a face like a cracked riverbed and eyes that had seen too many things go wrong in too many years, and he looked at August the way a man looks at a dog about to run into a busy street. "Son," Hector said, low and careful, "you seem like a decent fellow, a hard worker. I can tell these things, and I'm going to do you the Christian courtesy of a fair warning before you go and ruin yourself." August had just tied his roan horse, a steady-tempered animal he called Bishop, to the hitching post outside the general store. He was 26 years old, lean but broad through the shoulders, with dark hair that curled slightly at the temples when the weather turned warm, and a jaw that had been described by more than one woman as unfairly attractive. He had come to Dusty Creek from San Antonio, having heard there was work on the Callahan Ranch north of town, good pay for an experienced hand, and he had every intention of staying no longer than a season. He was not looking for complications. "Warning about what?" he asked. Hector tilted his chin toward the building across the street. "You'll see her soon enough. Theresa Wainwright runs the dressmaking shop there with her aunt, pretty as a painting and twice as dangerous. She's had 4 men in this town lose their minds over her. One of them quit his job, sold his horse, and tried to follow her to El Paso when she left 2 years ago. She came back alone, of course. Always does." August looked across the street at the neat little shop with the blue curtain in the window. A painted sign above the door read Wainwright and Dove Fine Dressmaking. He looked at it a moment, then looked back at Hector. "I appreciate the warning," he said, and walked into the general store to buy a tin of tobacco and a new pair of work gloves. He met her 3 days later. He had not sought her out. He had ridden out to the Callahan spread Monday morning, met the foreman, a straight-backed German man named Ernst Vogel, and been put to work immediately mending fences in the north pasture. It was honest, physical labor, and August was good at it, moving through the work with the quiet efficiency of a man who had spent his entire adult life doing things with his hands. He liked the open sky and the smell of the grass, and the way the land rolled out in every direction like God had smoothed it with a great slow hand. He came into town on Thursday for supplies, and that was when it happened. He was walking out of the general store with a wrapped parcel of salt pork and dried beans when a stack of hat boxes came tumbling off the boardwalk in front of him, scattering across the dusty street, and the woman trying to catch them crashed directly into his chest. He caught her by reflex, one arm around her shoulders, the other reaching automatically for the nearest tumbling box. She was warm and solid and smelled of lavender and something faintly like cedar, and she pulled back immediately with the particular dignity of a woman who has absolutely no intention of being embarrassed. "I beg your pardon," she said. "No pardon needed," he said. "Are you hurt?" She looked up at him then, and he understood, in a way that was immediate and entirely inconvenient, what Hector Barnes had been trying to tell him. Theresa Wainwright was 23 years old, with dark copper-red hair that caught the afternoon light like a struck match, and eyes the color of good whiskey, amber and warm and lit from somewhere deep inside. She had a dusting of freckles across her nose and cheeks that she made absolutely no effort to hide, a strong jaw, and a mouth that was currently pressed into a flat line of determination as she assessed the situation of her scattered hat boxes with rapid, calculating eyes. She was wearing a green dress the color of new sage leaves, and her hair was pinned up imperfectly, a few strands escaping to curl at her neck. She was, in the most straightforward and inconvenient sense of the word, extraordinary. "I am not hurt," she said, already bending to collect the nearest box, "but my aunt's best work certainly will be if these get any more dust on them." August set down his parcel and began gathering boxes without being asked, handing them to her one by one while she stacked them with practiced efficiency. He noticed her hands quick and sure, the hands of someone who worked with precision and purpose. "New in town?" she asked without looking at him. "3 days," he said. "August Walden, I'm working out at the Callahan place." She glanced at him sideways. "Theresa Wainwright." "I know," he said, and then wished immediately that he hadn't, because she straightened and looked at him directly, and there was something sharp and very aware in those amber eyes. "I imagine you do," she said, "and I imagine whoever told you also had a great deal of interesting things to say." "Hector Barnes said you were pretty as a painting and twice as dangerous," August said, because he had learned young that most trouble came from dancing around the truth rather than stating it plainly. Something flickered across her face, not quite amusement, not quite pain, but somewhere in between. She took the last hat box from his hands and settled the stack against her hip. "Hector Barnes has known me since I was 6 years old and has never once managed to see past the first layer of anything," she said. "Thank you for the help, Mr. Walden." She walked away. He watched her go, and then he picked up his parcel and walked in the opposite direction and told himself very firmly that he was not going to think about her. He thought about her all the way back to the ranch, which was 11 miles. It was not like him. August Walden was not a man given to romantic entanglements or emotional carelessness. He had grown up the third son of a struggling cattle rancher outside San Antonio, had worked since he was old enough to be useful, and had learned early that feelings, while real, needed to be managed with the same practical attention you gave to anything else that could get out of hand. He had been fond of a girl in San Antonio named Clara 3 years ago, but that had ended with her choosing a banker's son and him choosing to leave for new country, and he had done both those things without excessive drama. He was not the type to lose his head, and yet on Friday he found himself inventing a reason to ride into town again. He needed a new cinch strap, he told himself. The old one was wearing thin. This was partially true. It was also partially true that Ernst Vogel kept a full supply of cinch straps in the tack barn, and August had simply not checked there before saddling Bishop and heading south toward town. He did not go to the dressmaking shop. He was not that far gone. He bought the cinch strap at the general store, stopped at the small restaurant on the main street for a bowl of stew he did not particularly need, and was on his way back to Bishop when he heard his name. "Mr. Walden." She was sitting on the bench outside the post office, a small paper-wrapped parcel in her lap, reading a letter. She had looked up at him with that direct, assessing gaze that he was already beginning to recognize as simply the way she looked at everything, as though she were taking an accurate inventory of the world around her. "Miss Wainwright," he said, stopping. "You don't have to stop," she said. "I only called your name to see if you'd heard me." He looked at her. "And now you know I did." The corner of her mouth pulled up. Not quite a smile, something better than a smile, actually, something more real. "I owe you a thank you that was more sincere than what I managed yesterday," she said. "I was flustered, and I'm not very graceful when I'm flustered." "You seemed entirely graceful to me," he said honestly. She looked at him for a moment with those amber eyes, and then she folded her letter and tucked it into the parcel. "Sit down if you have time," she said, gesturing to the bench. "I've been sitting here alone for 20 minutes and I'm tired of my own company." He sat. They talked for an hour on that bench outside the post office, while Dusty Creek went about its afternoon business around them. She told him she had grown up partly here and partly in El Paso, that her parents had died of fever when she was 14, that she had come to live with her Aunt Dove, who was her mother's sister and the finest seamstress in 3 counties, and that she had learned the trade herself because she had a talent for it, and because she needed work she could be proud of. He told her about San Antonio, about his family's ranch, about the years of drifting from one job to another that had eventually brought him north to Dusty Creek. She asked good questions, the kind that proved she had been listening rather than simply waiting for her turn to speak. He found himself saying things he did not usually say, not secrets exactly, but private things, truths about what he wanted and what he didn't, said in the natural, easy way that happens sometimes between strangers who are somehow already comfortable with each other. When she finally stood to go, she looked at him for a moment with an expression he couldn't quite decode. "I should tell you something," she said, "since you were honest with me about what Hector said." "All right," he said. "The things they say about me in this town are not entirely wrong," she said. "I am not easy. I am not simple. I have broken hearts that I did not intend to break, and that does not make me feel good about myself, but it is still true. And I have found it is kinder to say so plainly than to let a man discover it on his own after a long time." He looked at her standing there in the afternoon light, steady and direct and a little sad around the edges, telling him this hard truth as a courtesy, as a gift of sorts, and he felt something in his chest shift and settle in a way he hadn't expected. "I appreciate that," he said. "Most people aren't that honest. Most people are afraid of honesty," she said. "Are you?" She tilted her head slightly. "Sometimes, but I'm more afraid of dishonesty." She walked back toward her shop. He untied Bishop and rode back out to the ranch, and the whole 11 miles he was turning what she had said over in his mind, examining it from different angles, and arriving at the same conclusion every time, that what she had told him was meant to be a warning, and that it had somehow, paradoxically, made him want to know her more rather than less. He told Danny Pratt about it that evening. Danny was a young ranch hand, 20 years old, from a farm family in East Texas, cheerful and talkative, and the kind of person who managed to be everyone's friend without particularly trying. They were mending tack by lamplight in the bunkhouse, and August told the whole thing plainly, because he found plain speech came naturally to him, and because Danny was good at listening even if he was also good at saying foolish things. Danny set down the bridle he was working on and looked at August with the particular expression of a young man who has heard something important and is working out how to respond to it. "You know what they say about her," Danny said. "I've heard what they say," August said. "She left a man named Clifford Hale so broken up he couldn't work for a month," Danny said. "They were practically engaged. Then one morning he made a gesture with his hand. Gone, said she wasn't ready for what he wanted. He near about lost his mind." August ran a thumb along the leather strap he was oiling and did not say anything. "I'm just saying," Danny offered, "you might want to be careful." "She told me herself she's not easy," August said. Danny blinked. "She told you that? First time I talked to her, pretty much." Danny stared at him. "And you're still—" "I'm not doing anything," August said firmly. "I just had a conversation with a woman on a bench." "I'm not doing anything." He went asleep that night and dreamed about amber eyes and lavender and cedar, which was not exactly nothing, but which he decided to keep strictly to himself. The following weeks moved forward with the steady rhythm of working life on a cattle ranch in the Texas spring of 1878, and August Walden threw himself into that rhythm with everything he had. The days were long and physical, riding fence lines, moving cattle to new pasture, helping Vogel oversee the branding of the spring calves, repairing the east barn roof that had developed a concerning sag over the winter. The work was good and the pay was fair, and August, standing on the ranch, climbed quickly because he was capable and reliable, and because he had a natural way with both horses and other men that made him easy to work alongside. He saw Theresa twice more that month. Once at the general store, where they spoke briefly and easily for a few minutes before she went on her way. Once at the small church social that the town held on the last Saturday evening of April, where the benches were pushed back along the walls, and a fiddler named Old Pete Calhoun played, while couples danced and children ran underfoot, and the women had laid out pies and cornbread on a long table near the door. August had gone because Danny dragged him, and because he'd had enough of the bunkhouse by that point in the week. He stood near the wall with a cup of punch that was mostly just sweetened water, watching the dancing with the mild enjoyment of a man who is comfortable in company without needing to be at the center of it. He noticed Theresa across the room almost immediately. It was not difficult. She had a quality of aliveness about her that drew the eye even when she wasn't doing anything in particular. She was talking to a woman he didn't know, laughing at something, her copper hair catching the lantern light. She caught his eye across the room, and something passed between them, quick and warm and not quite anything he had a name for yet. She excused herself from the woman she was talking to and crossed the room with the kind of easy confidence that looks like it came naturally, but which August was beginning to suspect had been built carefully over years. "Mr. Walden," she said, arriving beside him, "you look like a man standing at the edge of a dance floor trying to decide whether or not to step onto it." "I look like a man drinking bad punch," he said. She laughed, and it was a real laugh, unguarded, and it landed somewhere in the vicinity of his sternum with a force he was thoroughly unprepared for. "It is very bad punch," she agreed. "Aunt Dove adds sugar to everything because she thinks it will make people happier." "I don't think she's wrong exactly, but there is a limit." "Are you going to dance?" he asked. "Are you asking?" He looked at her. She was watching him with those amber eyes, direct and a little amused and a little careful all at once, and he made a decision that was not really a decision at all because it had already been made in the moment he caught her eye across the room. "Yes," he said. "I'm asking." She smiled a full, genuine smile this time, no holding back, and took his offered hand. He was a decent dancer, nothing fancy, but steady and sure on his feet, and she moved easily in his arms, responsive and light without being passive, and they danced 2 dances while old Pete Calhoun played and the room turned around them. They talked while they danced, easy conversation about nothing in particular, and August was struck again by that quality of effortless honesty she had, the way she simply said what she thought and asked what she wanted to know without performing or pretending. At the end of the second dance, she stepped back and looked at him with an expression that was both warm and very careful. "Thank you," she said. "You're a good dancer." "You're better," he said. "I've had more practice." She paused. "August Walden, I have enjoyed talking to you more than I have enjoyed talking to most people in a good long while, and I think you should know that." He understood then that she was also telling him she was worried about it, that the enjoyment itself was the thing she was being cautious about. He could feel the shape of what she wasn't saying clearly enough to almost hear it. "I'm not going anywhere in a hurry," he said, "and I don't expect anything from you." She held his gaze for a long moment, and then nodded once, and went back to her aunt across the room, and he spent the rest of the evening standing by the wall with his bad punch, feeling oddly content. The friendship, if that was what it was, grew through May and into June in the particular way that things grow in good soil, not by dramatic leaps but by steady accumulation, the way a river rises, inch by inch, until suddenly you notice it has become something substantial. He began stopping by the dressmaking shop on his trips into town, not every time, but often enough that it became a natural part of his visits rather than an event. Aunt Dove, who turned out to be a small, sharp-eyed woman of about 60 with silver hair and strong opinions about nearly everything, welcomed him with a brisk hospitality that he found very satisfying, because it was honest. She fed him pie when she had it and tea when she didn't, and she called him August within 5 minutes of their first meeting, and never once went back to Mr. Walden. Dove had come to Dusty Creek from Georgia 17 years ago with her husband, who had died of a bad chest the following winter, and left her alone with a shop she had built with her own 2 hands. She was a woman who had been through genuine hardship, and had emerged from it not bitter but brisk. She wasted nothing, including sentiment. She loved Theresa with a ferocious, unsentimental love that expressed itself mainly in good cooking, high standards, and the occasional sharp word delivered precisely where it was needed. One afternoon in early June, when Theresa had gone to make a delivery and August was sitting at the table in the back of the shop eating apple pie, Dove set down her sewing and looked at him with those sharp eyes. "You're falling in love with her," she said. August chewed his pie and thought about this. "I'm her friend," he said. "You can be both," Dove said. "Usually one comes before the other. The question is whether you've thought carefully about what that means in her particular case." She told me herself she's not easy, he said. Dove picked up her sewing again. She told you a fact. I'll tell you the why of it, which she won't, because she doesn't quite understand it herself. She pulled a stitch through, precise and unhurried. Theresa loved her parents more than anything in the world. She was 14 when they died within 6 weeks of each other, and it near about destroyed her. She came to me so broken I wasn't sure she'd come back whole. She pulled another stitch. She did, mostly. But what she learned from it, the lesson the loss burned into her, is that loving something completely is the fastest road to losing yourself when it's gone. So she loves at a certain distance. She gives you 90 of herself and holds 10 back always, and the 10 she holds back is the piece that would let her stay. August was quiet for a moment. Outside, the main street went about its business. A wagon creaked by. Somewhere a dog was barking. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked. Dove looked at him. "Because you're the first person she's talked to freely in 2 years, she said. "And because I can tell you're the kind of man who would rather know the whole landscape before he walks into it." He thought about that for a long time afterward. He thought about it while he worked and while he rode and while he lay in the bunkhouse at night listening to the other men sleep. He thought about the girl of 14 who had lost both parents in 6 weeks, and about the woman she had become, strong and direct and warm and careful, carrying that old wound so quietly that most people never even knew it was there. He thought about all the men before him who had loved her and lost her, and he thought about what it meant to know all of that and still feel what he felt. Danny Pratt found him sitting on the fence one evening watching the sun go down over the north pasture, and came and sat beside him in the amiable, companionable way that Danny did everything. "You're thinking about her," Danny said. "I'm watching the sunset," August said. "You've got the look of a man thinking about a woman," Danny said cheerfully. "I've seen it enough to know." August was quiet. Then, "They warned me she'd break my heart." Danny nodded slowly. "That's what they say." August watched the sun sink lower, the sky turning from gold to orange to a deep, rich red above the dark line of the land. "I've been thinking," he said, "that I'd rather have a broken heart than an empty one." Danny was quiet for a moment. Then he said very sincerely, "August, that is either the most romantic or the most foolish thing I have ever heard anyone say." "Probably both," August agreed. The summer of 1878 in Dusty Creek unrolled with the particular dry heat of the Texas plains, the kind of heat that sat on everything from late morning until well after dark, and turned the grass to gold and cracked the earth, and made the horses drowsy and irritable. August worked long hours and sweated through his shirts and developed a dark tan across the back of his neck and the tops of his forearms. And on the evenings and weekends when he came to town, he sat with Theresa on the bench outside the post office or at the table in the back of Dove's shop, and they talked the way people talk when they have found a frequency only they can hear. She told him about El Paso, where she had lived for a year between the ages of 19 and 20, trying to find something she couldn't quite name. She told him about a woman she had befriended there, a Mexican seamstress named Lucia, who had taught her the particular fine embroidery work that sometimes appeared on the collars and cuffs of the dresses she and Dove made, and how Lucia had also taught her that beauty in the work mattered as much as the practical purpose of the thing, which was something she had applied ever since to everything she made. She told him about coming back to Dusty Creek feeling both defeated and somehow right, as though she had needed to leave to understand what she had here. He told her about his brother James, who had died at 18 in a cattle drive accident, a fact he carried quietly but always. He told her about the specific particular loneliness of being a traveling man, the way the miles accumulated under you, until you sometimes felt that you were made of nothing but forward motion, and how strange it felt to be in a place long enough to know people's names and stories. He told her things he did not usually tell people, not because he was hiding them but because most people did not ask in the way she asked, with genuine attention and the patience to sit in silence after a thing was said rather than rushing to fill it. The distance between them closed slowly, like weather moving across a plain visible at the edges, arriving before you could quite say when it had come. One afternoon in July, she took his hand while they were walking from the shop to the post office, just slipped her fingers through his without saying anything, and he adjusted his grip to hold her properly, and they walked the rest of the way like that, easy and quiet. And when they reached the post office, she squeezed once and let go and walked inside without making anything of it. He stood outside for a moment, looking at the door, and felt the particular bittersweet quality of a happiness that knows it might not last, like holding good fruit that is also fragile. He did not push. He understood by now that pushing was the wrong approach with Theresa Wainwright, not because she was fragile, she was anything but fragile, but because she needed the room to choose, clearly and freely, without pressure. She was a woman who had been controlled by loss and was now very careful about what she let herself belong to, and the gift he could give her was exactly that room. So he gave it and was patient, and trusted the thing between them to grow at its own pace. It was not easy. There were evenings when he lay in the bunkhouse and wanted very badly to tell her plainly what he felt, to have it out in the open and be done with the careful delicacy of managing his own feelings in the name of her comfort. He was a direct man, and indirectness cost him something. But he had learned from what Dove told him, from what Theresa herself had told him, from everything he had observed, that she was already taking a risk with him, already giving him more than she gave most people, and he was not going to spend that by rushing at the end of it. In August, the month, not the man, though the coincidence of his name and the month of the year did not escape her. She pointed it out once with that sideways almost smile, and he had said, "I was made for August," and she had looked at him with something he couldn't quite read. The trouble came. It came in the form of a man named Harlan Booth. Harlan Booth was 35 and broad and loud, and owned a successful cattle operation 15 miles east of town, which meant he had money and a degree of local standing that he wore like a coat he was very proud of. He had been interested in Theresa before August's arrival, and had apparently assumed, as men like Harlan Booth tended to assume, that time and persistence and the weight of his own importance would eventually succeed where direct appeal had not. August became aware of this when Harlan rode up to the dressmaking shop one afternoon, while August was sitting on the bench out front whittling, which he did sometimes while he waited for Theresa to finish with a customer. Harlan looked at August on the bench and then looked at the shop and then looked at August again. "You're the Callahan hand," Harlan said, from the back of a very fine bay horse. "August Walden," August agreed, not looking up from his whittling. "You've been making a habit of coming around here," Harlan said. "Miss Wainwright is a friend of mine," August said. Harlan's expression shifted into something that was not quite hostility but was adjacent to it, the expression of a man who has considered himself to have an unofficial claim on something and has just found another man sitting on it. "She's a woman people get the wrong ideas about," Harlan said. "She's friendly. It don't always mean what men think it means." August set down his knife and looked at Harlan directly. "Are you trying to tell me something specific?" he asked. "Because I'm listening if you are, but I find it easier to respond to plain speech than to implications." Harlan studied him for a moment. "Just saying," he said, "that a traveling man ought to think twice before he gets too settled into things that were there before he arrived." "Things," August said. "Situations," Harlan said. "I'll bear that in mind," August said, and picked up his knife again. Harlan rode on. That evening August mentioned it to Theresa, because he had decided early that he was not going to manage things on her behalf without her knowledge. She listened with the particular still attention she brought to things she was taking seriously, and when he was finished she was quiet for a moment. "Harlan Booth has been calling on me, or trying to, for the better part of 2 years," she said. "I have told him plainly that I don't wish to be courted by him. He has not entirely accepted that." "Does he trouble you?" August asked. "He is tiresome," she said carefully. "He has never been frightening. He is the kind of man who believes his own desire constitutes a reason, if that makes sense." "It makes sense," August said. "Do you want me to say something to him?" She looked at him with a flash of something sharp and warm at once. "I can manage Harlan Booth myself," she said. "I know you can," he said. "I'm asking if you want company." The warmth in her eyes deepened and the sharpness softened, and she looked at him for a moment the way you look at something you are very carefully allowing yourself to want. "No," she said, "but thank you." He nodded and let it go. He trusted her. It was that simple. Harlan Booth's next move was subtler and more aggravating. He began, at the end of August and into September, making a point of being wherever August was when the town was gathered for something. The Saturday markets, the occasional social evenings. He positioned himself and smiled his wide, capable smile, and made a show of his land and his money in the understated but unmistakable way of a man who is conducting a competition and wants the other party to know it. He was never openly rude to August and never openly rude to Theresa, which made him difficult to object to. What he could not account for, and what August eventually understood had settled the matter more finally than any direct confrontation could have, was the simple fact of what August and Theresa were to each other. It was not the showy performance of courtship. It was quieter and more real than that. It was the ease between them, the shorthand that had developed across months of honest conversation, the way they moved in each other's presence like people who have learned the specific gravity of another person and no longer need to think about it. It was visible to anyone who watched them together, and apparently it was visible to Harlan Booth, because by mid-September he had stopped appearing in August's vicinity with pointed frequency, and Theresa mentioned one afternoon that he had written her a formal letter to the effect that he was removing himself from consideration, which was how he had phrased it, as though the matter had been a business transaction he was concluding. "Are you sorry?" August asked. She looked at him sideways. "No," she said. "Good," he said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said without looking at him, "You never pushed me, August. All these months you never once pushed." "You needed the room," he said. She turned to look at him then, really look at him, the way she sometimes did when she was setting aside the last of her careful distance and letting him all the way into focus. Her amber eyes were very bright. "I've been afraid," she said. "I want you to know that, not of you specifically, of what happens when something matters." "I know," he said. "I don't want to break your heart," she said. "I genuinely don't. I think about it and it." She stopped and pressed her lips together briefly, that old control reasserting itself, and then let it go again. "I don't want to hurt you." "Then don't," he said, which was simpler than any other answer he could have given and which was also absolutely honest, not a dismissal of the concern but a faith in her ability to choose, stated plainly. She stared at him. Something moved behind her eyes, something that had been held back for a long time coming slowly forward, stepping into the light carefully, the way an animal that has been frightened steps toward an offered hand, watching and wanting and not quite sure yet. "I could love you," she said. "That's the problem, that's exactly the problem. I could love you very much." "I know," he said again. "I could love you very much too." She looked down at her hands for a moment, those capable, precise hands, and he waited. He had gotten very good at waiting. "I'd like to try," she said finally, quietly. "If you're still willing, knowing what I've told you, knowing the way I am." "Theresa," he said, and his voice came out lower and more serious than he'd intended, the way the important things always came out when you stopped managing them. "I was warned you'd break my heart. I've known that from the first week. And I decided a long time ago that I would rather have a broken heart than an empty one." She looked at him for a long moment, and then she laughed, soft and a little undone, and leaned forward and kissed him, not dramatically, but with a sweetness and certainty that was better than dramatic, the kind of kiss that felt less like a beginning than like an arrival. He kissed her back, there on the bench outside the post office in Dusty Creek, Texas, in September of 1878, while the afternoon moved around them and the town went about its business, and somewhere above them, the sky was doing that particular western thing it did at this hour, turning the light to gold. The autumn that followed was the best 3 months of August Walden's life up to that point, and he was aware of it while it was happening, which was a kind of luck most people didn't get. He and Theresa moved into the acknowledged fact of what they were to each other with a naturalness that surprised him, given how carefully they had moved before. It was as though the long months of careful friendship had built a foundation so solid that the house that went up on it stood easy and straight without effort. They spent time together as freely as the days allowed, evenings at the shop, Sunday afternoons walking out along the creek that gave the town its name, an occasional supper with Dove, who received the development with the brisk satisfaction of a woman whose predictions had been correct. He learned her in the particular detailed way that you learn a person you love, the small things, the specific things, the way she held her coffee cup with both hands in the mornings, and the way she hummed almost inaudibly when she was concentrating, and the way her laugh, when it was fully unguarded, had a rough-edged quality that she seemed briefly surprised by every time it happened, as though she had forgotten it would sound like that. He learned that she was fearless about large things and occasionally undone by small ones, that she could sit in silence for an hour and be entirely comfortable, and then want to talk continuously for another hour, that she had a weakness for lemon drops when the general store had them, and a complete indifference to most other sweets. She learned him with equal attention, which was one of the things he loved about her, the reciprocity of it, the way being known by her felt like being seen by someone with very good eyes rather than being assessed by someone with good judgment. She knew when he was troubled before he said so, and left him space to come to it on his own. She knew when he wanted company and when he wanted the comfortable silence of her presence without conversation. She did not try to change him or improve him, which was the most remarkable thing of all, because most people, given a person they cared about, immediately began a subtle project of adjustments. Ernst Vogel, the ranch foreman, noticed that August had acquired a settled quality that had not been there in the spring, a groundedness that showed itself in his work and his demeanor alike. And he told August one morning over coffee that he was the best hand the Callahan outfit had taken on in 5 years, and that he hoped he intended to stay. "I intend to stay," August said, and meant it with a fullness he had not felt about any intention in a long time. He wrote to his father in San Antonio, for the first time in several months, and in the letter he described Theresa as a woman he intended to spend his life with if she would have him. His father wrote back 2 weeks later in the cramped, practical handwriting of a man who had worked with his hands all his life, saying that he was glad August had found good country and a good woman, and that he hoped both would last, and that he was proud of the man his son had become. August folded the letter and kept it in his coat pocket for a week. In November, the first real trouble arrived, not Harlan Booth this time, but something from the larger world outside Dusty Creek's small circle of daily life. The Callahan Ranch's neighbor to the northwest was a large operation called the Diamond Cross, owned by a man named Preston Webb, who had been in quiet dispute with old Martin Callahan over the location of their shared fence line for years. The dispute had never quite boiled over into something serious, but in November of 1878, a stretch of Diamond Cross cattle broke through a weakened section of fence and got into the Callahan North pasture, and when August and Danny Pratt rode out to push them back, 2 of Webb's men were already there and not especially pleased to see them. It did not come to violence. August was not a man who let things come to violence when words would do, but it was heated, and by the time Ernst Vogel arrived to manage the situation, there had been enough harsh language on both sides to make the men from Diamond Cross consider themselves to have a grievance. Over the following week, Webb sent a formal letter to Martin Callahan claiming that the fence in question had been moved, not broken, but deliberately moved onto Diamond Cross land, and threatening legal action. It was a nuisance and a distraction and a stress, and August was in the middle of it because he had been there that day, and because Martin Callahan, who respected his judgment, asked him to help compile the evidence that the fence had always been where it was, which involved riding the entire North Line 3 times over several cold days to record the locations of old post holes and natural markers. He came in from those rides tired and cold and irritable, and Theresa fed him supper and did not ask too many questions about the work and sat close beside him while he warmed up, and that particular quality of her company, the solid, specific presence of her, the warmth of a person who was genuinely glad to have you there, was worth more than he could calculate. "You're good at this," he told her one evening. "Being steady." She looked at him. "I'm learning to be," she said. "I am trying, August. I want you to know that. I am trying not to run when it feels like," she paused, assembling words, "when it feels like too much." "I know you are," he said. "Does it show?" She asked, with a hint of self-consciousness she rarely showed. "It shows," he said, "as courage, which is what it is." She was quiet, and then she leaned into him and he put his arm around her, and they sat like that while the cold November wind ran across the plains outside and the lamp made everything warm and near. The fence dispute with Preston Webb was ultimately resolved in early December in the only way that kind of thing got resolved in the Texas of 1878, by bringing in a surveyor from the county seat, a meticulous man named Mr. Crawford, who spent 2 weeks taking measurements and consulting old land records, and ultimately produced a written report confirming that the fence had been correctly placed on the Callahan side of the line all along. Preston Webb did not formally apologize, but he did send over a side of beef at Christmas with a note that said simply that the matter was resolved and that he hoped to have no further difficulties with his neighbors, which was as close as a man like Webb came to conceding he had been wrong. The relief at the ranch was palpable, and Martin Callahan celebrated by throwing a Christmas party in the ranch house that included most of the town, since Callahan was a civic-minded man who liked to return his good fortune to the community when he could. It was the most elaborate gathering Dusty Creek had seen all year, with a proper fiddle band and more food than could be reasonably consumed, and a decorated pine that the ranch hands had cut and hauled in from the hills 2 days prior. August brought Theresa and Aunt Dove, and the 3 of them arrived together in a buckboard he had borrowed from the ranch, which was the kind of small domestic arrangement that Dove greeted with completely unconcealed pleasure, and that Theresa navigated with a mixture of happiness and the faint watchfulness of a person still not entirely used to happiness being their natural due. She wore a dress she had made herself, dark blue with fine ivory embroidery at the collar and cuffs, and she had done something with her hair that left it partly down, copper-red waves over her shoulders, and August, who was sitting next to her in the buckboard with the reins in his hands and the cold December night above them, looked at her in the light of the lantern hung on the buckboard post and thought, with a simplicity and certainty that required no decoration, that he loved her. Not that he could love her very much, as he had said months ago on the bench, that he did. Fully and without reservation, with the complete investment of himself that he had been careful about all his life and had never quite managed before. He did not say it that night. The party was not the place, but he carried it with him through the evening, warm and settled, and danced with her twice and watched her laugh with Dove and with Danny Pratt's mother, who had come down from her farm for the occasion, and felt the profound, uncomplicated rightness of it. He told her in January. It was a Sunday afternoon, cold and clear, one of those winter Texas days where the sky is an almost painful shade of blue, and the cold has a dry precision to it that is different from the wet cold of other climates. They had walked out along the creek, bundled in their coats, and had come to the flat stone outcropping near the old cottonwood that they had come to think of as their particular spot. The place they ended up when they walked that direction, the place where they sat and talked and watched the water. She was sitting on the stone with her knees drawn up and her arms around them, looking at the creek, and he sat beside her and looked at her, and then said what he had been carrying since December. "I love you, Theresa." She did not move for a moment. Then she turned and looked at him with those amber eyes that he knew now as well as he knew anything in the world, and they were very bright and very careful and very alive. "I know," she said softly. "I'm not telling you to make you say it back," he said. "I'm telling you because it's true and because I don't want to keep it inside just to make things easier. I love you, that's all." She looked at him for a long moment. The creek moved past below them. A hawk rode a thermal above the bare cottonwood. "I love you," she said. "I have loved you for a good while. She stopped. "I have been sitting with it, trying to make sure it was real and not just wanting something to be real. And it's real." She said the last words simply, as though she were stating a natural fact about the landscape. And then she leaned against him and his arm came around her, and they sat in the cold blue January afternoon, while the creek talked quietly below, and August felt something in him that had been held careful and prepared for a long time finally simply rest. The spring of 1879 arrived with the particular optimism of Texas springs, the grass coming green again, and the air turning warm by degrees, and the sense, universal on a cattle ranch in breeding season, of the world renewing itself according to its own long habits. August had been at the Callahan place for a full year, and Ernst Vogel had promoted him to assistant foreman over the winter, which came with better pay and a private room in the foreman's quarters rather than the bunkhouse. He had also, with that better pay, begun quietly setting aside money with a specific purpose in mind. He had spoken with Theresa's Aunt Dove in February, sitting at the back table in the shop over coffee, asking her plainly for her blessing to ask Theresa to marry him. Dove had looked at him over her cup with those sharp eyes for a long moment before saying, equally plainly, that she had given her blessing in her heart the previous autumn, and that he was simply good enough to have waited until he could say it properly. Then she had poured him more coffee and told him to have a piece of pie, and said absolutely nothing else on the subject, which was exactly the right response. He asked Theresa on a Saturday afternoon in March, at their flat stone by the cottonwood, with a ring he had ordered from a jeweler in Austin, a simple gold band set with a small amber stone that he had chosen without much hesitation because it was the same color as her eyes. He did not make a grand speech of it. He told her he wanted to build something with her, a life that was specific and real and theirs, and that he wanted her beside him for it, all of her, including the 10% she had always kept back. She looked at the ring in his open palm for a moment with an expression that moved through several things very quickly: surprise and something like fear, and then something that was not quite either, that was more like a door opening. "The 10%, she said quietly. "All of you," he said. "I want all of you, and I'll give you all of me." She lifted the ring from his palm and held it for a moment. "If I say yes," she said slowly, "and I'm saying yes, I want you to know if I say yes, I mean it completely. I won't hold back the way I have before. I want to try to be as brave as you've been." "You've always been brave," he said. "You've been brave since the day you sat on that bench and told me the honest truth about yourself before I even knew to ask." She looked at him for a long time. Then she held out her hand, and he took the ring from her and slid it onto her finger, and she looked at it sitting on her hand and then looked at him, and what was in her eyes was something he had never quite seen there before, an openness, an absence of the last fine guard she had always kept, a fullness that was also a surrender of the careful partial distance she had maintained against exactly this kind of love. She kissed him in the March afternoon by the cottonwood, and he held her with both arms, and she let herself be held completely. They were married in June of 1879, in the small white church on the east side of Dusty Creek's Main Street, by a preacher named Reverend Aldridge, who had been in the town for 7 years, and who performed the ceremony with a simple dignity that neither August nor Theresa had asked for explicitly, but which was exactly right. Aunt Dove sat in the front pew in her best dress, gray silk with the ivory embroidery that was her signature work, and did not cry until the ring was on Theresa's finger, and then cried quietly and with great restraint for approximately 45 seconds before producing a perfectly laundered handkerchief and composing herself. Danny Pratt was August's best man and stood beside him in the clean suit he had borrowed from Martin Callahan, who was taller, which made for a jacket that was slightly too long in the arms, but Danny wore it with complete cheerful confidence. Ernst Vogel was there with his wife. Most of the town was there, including, to August's mild surprise, Hector Barnes, who shook his hand afterward with a grip that was both firm and somewhat apologetic. "I may have been hasty in my assessment," Hector said. "You did me a kindness," August said. "The warning was honest. I'm grateful for it." Hector blinked. "Grateful? I knew what I was walking into," August said. "That's a better position than not knowing." Hector looked at Theresa across the churchyard, radiant in the white dress she and Dove had spent 3 months making, standing in a circle of well-wishers, laughing at something someone had said. He looked back at August. "I suppose it is," he said, and something in his weathered face shifted toward something like respect. The reception was held at the ranch, because Martin Callahan had offered the use of his great yard and his barn and had insisted, with the cheerful authority of a man who enjoys spending money on good occasions, on providing the majority of the food. There was a whole roasted steer and cornbread, and 3 kinds of pie, and a barrel of decent whiskey, and a fiddler, who was better than old Pete Calhoun and who played until almost midnight without stopping, except to drink. August and Theresa danced in the warm June night under a sky full of stars, surrounded by the people of the town that had become, over the past year, theirs, genuinely, specifically, irrevocably theirs. He held her close and she had her face near his shoulder, and they moved in the easy way they had moved since that first night at the April social, the way of people who know each other's specific gravity. "Are you frightened?" he asked her quietly. She was quiet for a moment and he felt her breath against his collar. "Not the way I expected to be," she said. "I thought I would be terrified, the way I've always been when something mattered this much, but I'm not." She lifted her head and looked at him, and her amber eyes were warm and sure in the starlight. "I feel steady," she said, "like standing on good ground." He kissed her there on the dance floor in front of everyone, and several people cheered, and Danny Pratt made a noise that was somewhere between a whoop and a whistle. And Aunt Dove, who was sitting in a chair near the barn door with a glass of whiskey and Martin Callahan's company, smiled in the brisk, satisfied way of a woman who has seen something she worked hard to make possible come exactly right. The life they built in the years that followed was not a simple life, because real lives are not simple, but it was a good one, substantial and specific and growing. August rose steadily in his work. By 1881, he was the full foreman of the Callahan operation, Martin Callahan having stepped back from the daily running of the ranch due to a heart condition that required him to manage from the shade of his porch rather than from the saddle. And August ran the place with the competence and fair-mindedness that had always characterized his work, earning the respect of every hand on the property and the neighboring ranches alike. In 1883, with money carefully saved over 5 years and a loan from Martin Callahan that was extended with sincere generosity and detailed repayment terms, he and Theresa purchased a section of land 2 miles north of town, 160 acres of good grass with a creek cutting through the southern corner, and a stand of live oaks along the ridge that gave shade in the summer and shelter in the winter. They built their house together, which was less metaphor than literal fact. August and Danny Pratt and Ernst Vogel's 2 oldest sons spent 3 weeks in the spring of 1883 framing and raising the structure, while Theresa and Dove directed the interior details with the combined authority of 2 women who had very specific ideas about how spaces should work and look. The house was not large, but it was well made, with a covered porch facing south and windows designed to catch the prevailing breeze, and a kitchen that Dove correctly identified as the most important room in any house, and which was given proportionate space and attention. The dressmaking shop continued to prosper. Dove's eyesight was beginning to slow her finest work by 1882, though she would not admit this directly, and simply began assigning all detailed embroidery to Theresa, who had long since surpassed even her aunt's considerable skill. Theresa had also, quietly and without making much of it, begun taking on apprentices, young women from the town, and the surrounding farms who came to learn the work and who left after a year or two able to support themselves by their own craft, which was something that mattered deeply to Theresa, more than she usually said. There was a girl named Clara Finch, 17 when she arrived in 1882, who came from a poor farming family near the edge of the county, and who had an instinctive talent for the work that Theresa recognized immediately and cultivated with the same careful patience August had once shown her. August watched his wife work with this girl, and with the others who came through the shop over the years, with a quality that he could only describe as the particular joy of a person who has found the thing they were built to give, and it was one of the things he loved about her most. In December of 1883, their son was born. They named him James, after August's brother, which was August's idea, said quietly one evening while they were discussing names, and Theresa had looked at him with complete understanding and immediate agreement, and had reached across the table and taken his hand without saying anything at all. James Walden arrived in a hard winter, during a cold snap that had iced the creek and glazed the porch boards and turned the dawn sky a pale, flat white, delivered by the town's doctor, a competent, steady man named Dr. Holt, with Aunt Dove in attendance and August pacing the hall outside with the controlled precision of a man applying every mechanism of self-discipline he possessed to the task of not losing his mind. When Dr. Holt came out and told him it was done and they were both well, August went into the room and stood at the bedside where Theresa lay holding a red-faced and loudly vocal infant, and the look on her face was something he had no adequate words for and did not try to find. He sat on the edge of the bed, and she shifted to show him the baby, and he looked at his son with the complete overwhelmed tenderness that no man is ever really prepared for, no matter how sure he was that he was ready. "James," Theresa said, looking at the baby and then at August. "James," he agreed, and his voice was rough and he did not apologize for it. Dove, standing in the corner with her arms folded in her characteristic posture, said, "He has your jaw, August, which I consider a good thing for a boy," and went to put the kettle on. James Walden was a sturdy, serious-faced baby who became a cheerful, energetic toddler, pulling himself up on the porch railing and making determined runs toward the horses, and developing a fierce attachment to a specific battered blanket that accompanied him everywhere with a fidelity he did not yet apply to anything else. He had his mother's amber eyes and his father's dark hair, and his Aunt Dove's decided opinions about what he would and would not eat, which he expressed with volume and without ambiguity. August's life, moving through the middle years of the 1880s, had the quality he had imagined it might when he had sat on that fence with Danny Pratt and said he would rather have a broken heart than an empty one. It had not broken his heart. It had filled it deliberately, specifically, in the exact shape of the woman he had loved carefully and well and who had loved him back with the whole of herself, that last held-back portion finally, completely released. There were hard things. There were always hard things in a life honestly lived. In 1884, Aunt Dove had a stroke that left her unable to work for 2 months and left a permanent slight weakness in her left hand. She recovered more of her function than Dr. Holt had initially expected, because Dove was constitutionally unwilling to accept limitation, and she was back at her sewing within the year. But the finest embroidery work was beyond her now, and she acknowledged this with the same brisk directness with which she acknowledged everything. She moved into the house with August and Theresa after the stroke, the shop being rebuilt into a combination of working space and proper accommodation for her, with August building the addition himself over a hard-working summer. She brought her sewing and her particular approach to the world and her very decided opinions about the raising of James, who adored her with a devotion that was mutual and unconcealed on both sides. In 1885, a drought hit the Texas plains with a severity that taxed everyone. The grass on the Callahan property turned to dust, and the creek running through August and Theresa's land dropped to a fraction of its normal flow, and the cattle had to be pushed 50 miles south to better grazing, which cost weeks of grueling trail work and several head lost to the heat. There was a year of genuine financial strain, careful management of every dollar, economies both necessary and quietly painful. Theresa handled this with a capability that he had come to expect from her, but that still impressed him, because it was real capability, not the performance of competence but the genuine thing, applied practically. She took on twice as much work from the shop, including orders from as far away as Austin that came by letter and required careful sizing by correspondence. She organized their household with an efficiency that never felt like punishment. She did not worry aloud, which he knew took effort, because she did, in fact, worry, and he knew the shape of her worry from years of knowing her, and appreciated that she managed it privately so as not to make it a weight on him in addition to the weight of the work. He told her one evening during that hard year that she was the most capable person he had ever known. She looked at him from across the table where she was working on a commission piece, her needle moving in the steady, precise way it always moved. "I had good teachers," she said. "Dove taught you the sewing," he said. "Dove taught me a great many things," she said, "and so did you." "I didn't teach you anything," he said. She looked up at him. "You taught me that staying doesn't mean losing yourself," she said. "I thought they were the same thing. I thought if I really stayed, not just in my body but in my heart, that there would be nothing left of me that was my own. You taught me that isn't how it works. That being loved well doesn't diminish you. It enlarges you." She paused. "I needed to learn that. It took me a long time, but I learned it." He was quiet for a moment, looking at her across the lamplit table, this woman he had known for 7 years now, this woman who was more fully herself in every passing season, more known and more knowing, more entirely present in her own life and his. "Do you know," he said, "that the morning I rode into Dusty Creek I had every intention of staying one season and moving on?" "I know," she said. "Danny Pratt told me." He laughed, surprised, and she smiled her best smile, the full one, and went back to her needle. The drought broke the following year, as droughts eventually do. The grass came back and the creek recovered and the cattle moved north again, and the Callahan operation and the Walden land both rebounded with the particular vitality of things that have been tried and have held. In the summer of 1886, their second child arrived. A daughter they named Ruth Aliner for Theresa's mother, whom she had loved more than she could easily say, and whose name she said aloud now with a steadiness and a grief both old and at peace. Ruth was smaller than James had been at birth and had her mother's copper hair from the very beginning, and James, at 2.5 years old, inspected her with the serious gravity of a man who has encountered something important and is reserving judgment. His judgment was eventually and wholeheartedly positive. By the following spring he was following his sister around with a proprietary care that made Dove say she was going to make him a very fine husband someday if he could also learn to share his biscuits, which was currently a work in progress. Dusty Creek changed across the years of the 1880s, as small western towns were changing throughout Texas and the territory, the railroad having reached a town 20 miles east that had shifted the pattern of commerce and supply, new families coming in, new buildings going up, the old rough edges of frontier life being sanded down gradually by the accumulation of schools and churches, and the simple civilizing weight of people intending to stay. August watched these changes with the perspective of someone who had arrived in the raw early days of the place and had helped, in small ways, to build what it was becoming. He served on the town council beginning in 1885, not because he had sought political standing, but because Martin Callahan had asked him, and he had agreed because he thought it was a man's responsibility to do the work of the community he lived in. He was a useful council member, because he listened more than he talked and talked plainly when he did, and because his judgment was respected by people who had watched him work and live for years, and found him consistently honest and fair. Theresa became one of the most respected women in the county, not because she sought this either, but because of what her shop had become. Not just a place of commerce, but a place of genuine community for the women of the town and the surrounding region. A place where you could bring your troubles alongside your sewing needs and find both addressed with capability and discretion. The apprentices she had trained were working across the county now, and more than one of them had come back to tell her that what she had given them was not just a skill, but a changed life. Clara Finch, who had come to the shop in 1882 at 17, had married a schoolteacher from Austin named Henry Parks, and had her own small dressmaking operation in their town, and she wrote to Theresa regularly with the warm, consistent correspondence of someone who considers a debt so significant that it can only be repaid in loyalty. Theresa wrote back with equal warmth and the practical mentorship that she had never formally offered, but which was simply part of how she moved through the world. On a September evening in 1887, 8 years after he had ridden into Dusty Creek on a roan horse named Bishop, August Walden sat on the porch of his house on his 160 acres of Texas land with his wife beside him and the sounds of their children, and their aunt coming through the window from inside, and watched the sun go down over the western edge of the sky. The light was doing what it always did at this hour, turning from gold to orange to that deep, rich red he had watched from the fence rail on that evening when he had told Danny Pratt what he had decided about his heart. The grass was turning silver in the lowering light, and the creek was running at a good level, and the horses were moving in the far pasture with the slow contentment of animals at the end of a good day. Theresa had her hand in his, easy and warm. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "The day I rode in," he said. She looked at him with a small smile. 8 years ago last April. Hector Barnes had his hand on my shoulder and a very serious expression before I'd even untied my horse, August said. Theresa laughed softly. "What exactly did he say to you? You've never told me the whole of it." "He said stay away from Theresa Wainwright," August said. "That you were pretty as a painting and twice as dangerous." She shook her head with the fond exasperation of a woman who has spent years being both amused and mildly tired by the version of herself that existed in other people's imaginations. "Good heavens," she said. "And then you ran into me with a stack of hat boxes," August said. "I did not run into you," she said. "My hat boxes fell and you were in the vicinity." "You ran into me," he said. "I was in motion and you were stationary, and the laws of—" "You ran into me," he said, and his voice was warm with the deep pleasure of a long-established argument both parties enjoy enormously. She turned and looked at him, amber eyes bright in the evening light, and the years were in her face in the way that years are in a face you have loved, not as loss but as depth, as the accumulated record of a life fully lived. She was 32 years old and more beautiful to him now than she had been at 23, not because time had been kind to her in any conventional sense, but because he knew her now, knew the full landscape of her, and what he saw in her face was not just beauty but the person he loved completely. "August," she said. "Theresa," he said. She looked at him for a moment and then leaned her head against his shoulder. "I'm glad you didn't listen to Hector Barnes," she said. "I'm glad too," he said. The screen door opened and James appeared, 6 years old and already wearing the serious-faced determination of a boy who intended to be a man sooner than anyone had authorized, followed closely by Ruth at age 1.5, toddling with the slightly uncertain but thoroughly committed gait of someone who has recently decided that crawling is beneath her dignity. "Dove says supper," James announced. "Tell Dove we're coming," August said. James disappeared back inside. Ruth stood at the edge of the porch and looked at her parents with the considering expression that was already entirely her mother's, and then held out her arms, and Theresa reached down and scooped her up and settled her on her hip. Ruth patted Theresa's face with one small hand, the proprietary affection of a child who has never doubted she was loved, and Theresa caught August's eye over her daughter's copper head, and her face was open. Completely, simply open, in the way he had wanted for her since that first afternoon when Dove had told him about the 14-year-old girl who had learned to hold 10% back, because losing the whole of yourself was too much to survive. There was no held portion now. He could see it plainly, had been able to see it for years, but it was never less remarkable for being familiar. She had given herself over to this life and to him without reservation, and it had not diminished her but had made her more herself than she had ever been, more present and more alive and more capable, the love expanding her rather than consuming her the way the old fear had told her it would. He stood and put his arm around her, and she leaned into him, Ruth on her hip, and they went inside together where Dove was setting supper on the table with the brisk, efficient motion of a woman who has worked all her life and would work until she couldn't. And James was already in his chair with his fork in his hand with the look of a boy who considers himself kept waiting. And the lamp was lit, and the kitchen was warm, and the smell of Dove's cooking was everywhere, and it was home. Specifically and exactly and completely home. They sat down to supper, the five of them, and outside the Texas night settled in over the land that was theirs, the 160 acres of grass and creek and live oak, and somewhere out there Bishop, older now, slower in his joints but still sound, was standing in the near paddock in the dark, and the stars were coming out above the porch where August and Theresa had sat, and the town 2 miles south was lighting its lamps and settling into its evening. And the whole enormous western sky was full of the kind of dark that only exists where the land is wide, and the light pollution of another century has not yet arrived to thin it. August looked around the table at his family, at Dove dispensing food with impartial authority, at James addressing his supper with the intense focus of a young man who takes eating seriously, at Ruth in her high chair picking up individual peas with the laborious concentration of someone mastering a complex skill, at Theresa across the table, catching his eye with that small particular smile that was entirely for him, and felt in his chest the specific weight of a full life. Not the weight of burden but the weight of substance, of a thing that had real mass and real presence that could not be blown away. He thought of himself on that fence rail in the summer of 1878, 26 years old, working out in his mind whether to step toward something that had been clearly labeled dangerous. He had been warned she would break his heart. He remembered the calm with which he had arrived at his answer, that he would rather have a broken heart than an empty one. It had been a true statement at the time, made with the honest recklessness of a man who has not yet experienced what he is theorizing about. What he could not have known, sitting on that fence rail, was that he was wrong not about her, not about the risk, but about the outcome. She had not broken his heart. She had, with patience and courage and the hard work of a woman learning to trust what she had always been most afraid of, filled it instead. So completely, so specifically, so fully that there was no room left in it for the emptiness he had decided he could live without. He had been warned. He had made his choice. It had been the best choice he had ever made. Dove passed him the bread basket, and he took a piece, and passed it to James, and James received it with the gravity of a child receiving something he deserved, and Ruth said something to her peas in the private language of 1-year-olds, and Theresa said, across the table, "August, will you be riding out early tomorrow?" And he said yes, because there was a fence section to check in the north corner, and she said she would have coffee on before first light, and Dove said she would have biscuits, and was there any objection? And James said no objection, emphatically, and August laughed. And the sound filled the kitchen and went out through the walls into the warm Texas night, and the stars were bright above the porch where two people had once sat and decided, carefully and truly, to love each other without holding back. In the spring of 1889, Theresa told August over the breakfast table, with Ruth on her lap and James already outside with the dogs, that there would be a third child by November. He looked at her for a moment and then reached across the table and took her hand, and she looked at him with those amber eyes, warm and certain in his, and he brought her hand to his lips and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that the gesture didn't already contain. Dove, coming in from the kitchen with the coffee pot, took one look at both of them and said, "About time," with the brisk satisfaction of a woman who considers herself to have been waiting patiently and is glad the waiting is over. November came cold and clear, and the child arrived, another boy, dark-haired and loud, with his father's jaw and his mother's stubbornness already apparent in the set of his mouth. They named him David. James was 5 and utterly decisive about his role, protector, authority, and chief explainer of all things. Ruth was 3 and had opinions about the baby's crying volume that she expressed directly and without hesitation. Dove sat in her chair by the fire with a contentment she would never have described as such, but which was entirely visible in the ease of her hands and the quality of her silence. And August Walden, 47 years away from the end of the century, sitting in his house on his land in Dusty Creek, Texas, with his wife and his 3 children and the old woman who had loved them all into this life, understood with the complete and uncomplicated clarity of a man who has been paying honest attention, that the world could offer a person exactly this specific, warm and difficult and irreplaceable thing, and that to have it was not luck exactly, not gift exactly, but the accumulated result of one honest choice made on a fence rail on a summer evening when he was 26 years old, watching the sun go down over the Texas plain and deciding, finally and without reservation, that he would rather have a broken heart than an empty one. It had not been a broken heart. It had been the fullest heart he could have imagined. And every morning when Theresa handed him his coffee in the pre-dawn dark before he rode out, and every evening when he came home to the lit windows of his house and the sounds of his family inside, and every time she caught his eye across a room with that particular look that was entirely between them, he knew he had been right, not in the philosophy of the thing, not in some abstract sense about the nature of love and risk, but in the specific, particular, irreducible truth of this woman and this life, and this heart that she had filled so completely that the warning about breaking it had become, in the end, the most beautiful joke the years had ever told him. He had been warned she would break his heart. He had said he would rather have a broken heart than an empty one. And standing in the kitchen doorway of their house on a November morning, watching Theresa sit at the table with their newborn son on her chest, and their daughter leaning against her arm, and the coffee steam rising in the cold air, and Dove's biscuits browning in the oven, and James's boots on the porch, and the whole wide Texas sky out the south window turning pink with the coming day, August Walden understood that what he had actually gotten was neither of those things. What he had gotten was this, and this was everything.